All right. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Morning, Professor.
Can you hear me,
Yes.
right? Okay. Good. So as we said on Tuesday, today we're going to take care of some other questions you might have, and then we're going to have an introduction to Heidegger and the essay that that I uploaded the other day. By the way, did some of you already start reading the essay in the previous version that I uploaded a week ago?
I think Wei Min started reading.
What again?
I think Wei Min started reading the Heidegger first.
Okay, in the previous version, the one that I uploaded a week ago.
Yeah, he was sharing with me about the introduction to that passage.
Okay, all right, good. So now you have my version. As I told you, I hope to complete the task by Sunday. By Sunday, for sure, there will be the complete translation. I hope I can also add a few notes, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, so now let's go to your questions without further ado. And yeah, I'm here to listen to you. No questions? All right, then.
Hi, Prof. Actually, I did have a question. I was talking about this with Yong Chun actually. So the question is, does Plotinus ask us to respond to his work in any way? He does introduce some form of, normative standard of being wise is being better than foolish, but there's no explicit call to be wise. And so, like, what is he calling us to do in light of the entire theory of the world?
Okay. This question has to do with, I think, the how should I say, the problem, let's put it this way, of an ethics, right? Now, what usually people expect of philosophy these days is to provide them with an ethics of sort. And this ethics, in turn, is understood as a sort of rule of conduct, an ensemble of laws or an ensemble of indications on how one is supposed to live. Now, let's clarify first that ethics understood in this sense is not properly the task of philosophy. It comes in second position, so to say. So if we were to expect a philosopher to give us a rule of conduct, then we might be disappointed. And why is that? Why can't the philosopher give us a rule of conduct? Well, because the philosopher is the one who keeps thinking on whatever seems to be established once and for all. Hence, it cannot give us a rule of conduct in the sense of a guiding map, so to say, on how to behave and what to do. Even though, of course, that's something that philosophy doesn't discard as a necessity. I'm just saying that for true philosophy, it's very problematic to come up with an ethics. And that's because, as I said before, any ethics is always linked to a questioning regarding the principles. And the principles are not something that is easily graspable, if they are graspable at all. And in fact, if there are such things as principles. That's the first thing. Second, we must be clear on the word ethics. As I said, by ethics, we tend to understand the ensemble of some kind of rules of thought and action. However, the word ethics means more primarily the way in which something is, the abode of a thing, the way in which a thing usually abides or presents itself. So, for example, we can talk of ethology when it comes to animals, not because animals have an ethos in the sense of a morality, but because animals have a usual way of being, a way that belongs to them. So you can talk of the ethology of dogs, the ethology of ants, the ethology of chimpanzees, and so on and so forth. And when you say that, you are asking regarding how that particular animal behaves as that particular animal. Now, when it comes to the human being, what is the ethos of the human being? What is the way in which the human being abides, the way in which the human being is? That's a big question. So ethics, philosophically understood, has not to do with giving a roadmap, but it has to do with the interrogation of how the human being is. What does it mean to be human? That's the question of ethics. Now, if we look at it this way, does Plotinus give us a roadmap? No, he doesn't, of course. Does he have an ethical question? Yes, of course, because he's telling us that to be human means ultimately to be wise. And to be wise means what? To be wise means to become one with that silent logos out of which all things come, the silent logos of the nous. Hence, to be man means to abandon discursive thought. The real man is the man that lives before discursive thought. So does Plotinus have an ethical stance? Yes, he does. And is one whereby, as for any philosophy worth of this name, he tells us what man is. The true man is the silent thought out of which discursive thought comes. Are we that man yet? No, we have to become that man. So that's the moral, if you will, mandate that Plotinus gives us. I don't know if I answered your question.
Somewhat, but I think following from that, the question would be, as a means to achieving the end of being wise, do you think it is disingenuous to apply concepts external to Plotinus, for example, that of meditation, to as a way of achieving that? Or is that like our duty? It's supposed to, in our context, figure out what it means to be human and applying these concepts?
Well, Plotinus does give sparse suggestions every now and then on how to achieve wisdom, understood the way I did, the way I explained. And he says, for example, that one has to exercise his mind to get rid of all images, to eliminate all particulars, in such a way as to make a sort of void in the imagination. And once this void is reached, to stay in that void. And that void is what allows us to rest in proximity to the potency of the one. So, in other words, Plotinus suggests a sort of spiritual exercise to be practiced daily, I suppose. For example, his disciple Porphyry tells us that he himself saw Plotinus reaching the unity with the one through this kind of exercise 2 or 3 times. I don't remember how many times precisely. Another thing that Plotinus suggests is that of detaching oneself from any worldly and mundane preoccupation and activity. He himself led a life that was quite, segregated from worldly affairs, from politics, for example, which doesn't mean that he's suggesting we should neglect social life. It means that we shouldn't, according to him, invest ourselves in it. We should deal with it as much and as long as it is necessary, but no more than that. So these are, sort of practical, if you will, suggestions on how to attain wisdom. Any other question? You can ask also questions that I know that some of you, at least 2 of you have emailed me for consultation. The questions that you want to ask me during the consultation, you can ask me also here, because I believe, not that I believe, I've seen in the past, so I know out of experience that the question one student has are usually the questions that all other students have. So the questions that that those of you who wrote to me intend to ask me during the consultation, you can ask already now.
Professor, can I ask if Plotinus suggests this method to get closer to the one, then does that mean that the people from the different religions who engage in similar methods also come to the same understanding and become a wise man in a similar way? Or are they experiencing something entirely different?
Well, I cannot talk for the other religious experiences because I don't know much about them. I don't know enough about them. What I can talk about is the Christian experience. Now, in the, above all in the Orthodox Church, but also in the Catholic Church in certain cases, right? Well, in fact, we could say not only in certain cases, but in very important cases also in the Catholic Church, there is a practice, an ascetical practice that is very close to that of Plotinus. In the Eastern Church, this practice is called hesychasm. In the Catholic Church, in the Western Church, you have experiences such as that suggested by Meister Eckhart, for example. Now, so the practices are pretty much the same. Is the goal the same? That's a big question. In other words, is the one Plotinus says he has experienced the same as the light of God Saint Gregory Palamas says he has experienced, or Meister Eckhart says he has experienced? That's a big question, and honestly, I don't know. What is important, though, in both cases is that In both cases, what we have is a cessation of language in the sense of a cessation of discursive thought. And that's, I think, a problem. It's a problem in regards to the place that the human being comes to occupy in relation to this divine light or potency of the one, or whatever it is that these thinkers are experiencing. Why do I say that? Well, if the proper of man is language, and if man abides in language, or rather abides in language, if man manifests itself as man in language, the moment you discard language altogether, and the moment you suppose that you have reached a point at which language is not needed anymore, and hence can be discarded, at that point are you still men? And is this experience that you're talking about a real experience of getting out of the human dimension, or is just an illusion? And in fact, if this experience amounts with getting out of the human dimension, is it something possible to get out of the human dimension? And is it something wishable? Is it something auspicable? These are big problems, big problems. Now, in this sense, you can start seeing a difference with the thought of Heidegger. For Heidegger, the event of what is called in the translation by Stenbaum, appropriation, Ereignis, which I translate with bringing in the gaze, sort of. Well, that thing that Heidegger speaks about demands men to come to language. In other words, men for Heidegger is that in which being surfaces to language. And in that sense, being and men belong to each other. So if you compare it to what Plotinus says, in Heidegger, you have the almost perfect opposite of what Plotinus is saying. It's not the reaching of a place of silence, but is the attempt instead at articulating every time in a new language what surfaces through that reciprocal looking at each other that keeps men and being together. Okay, now I realize that what I'm saying is very difficult. I myself, every time is an effort to even just formulate these things. But yeah, these are the things that we're to try to focus our attention on. I don't know if I sort of gave you a satisfactorily enough answer, at least for the moment.
I think it's good because I mean, it's since the experiences are outside the realm of language, then it's also very hard to like consider if they are the same in the first place, because there are a lot of things that can be experienced but are hard to formulate, and so you cannot consider them exactly the same.
Yeah. All right, then I see there are other questions written down. Let me see. So Gerald says, does the power of growth have the act of vision? Well, of course, the power of growth is an act of vision, like anything that is. A little bit more on my end to formulate a good set of questions. Okay, William. Do you think we can validly extrapolate from Plotinus to explain the occurrence of certain mental disorders? What do you mean by this, Insing?
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hello. I was just thinking that, like, you know, like there seems to be like a lot of it's very common that people are always talking about how they are unable to grasp themselves in a certain way, and then, you know, this breeds like ferment some kind of distress that I don't know, but like there seems that a lot of people are plagued by these kind of occurrences or these kind of experiences, and in a way I think that quite easily we can in fact extrapolate from Plotinus to account for these kind of afflictions.
But in which way?
I mean, like, you know, I don't know if you observe this, but a lot of people will talk about how they are unable to see themselves, or like they are, or rather they behave as if they are unable to kind of see themselves in a concrete manner that distresses themselves. And so I thought that this strongly suggests that of like that incomplete vision of themselves that then unfolds in the praxis or the lowest
Yeah, it's interesting what you're suggesting. I mean, I don't know enough about psychological theory, even at an elementary level, to really see whether a fruitful connection can be built. But yeah, in a way, maybe one can use these conceptual apparatuses in order to talk about mental illness. But again, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought that
it's a possibility. It's something to explore. But as I said, I don't have the means to explore it.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
I guess it's like how, I guess we can go back, if we follow this train of thought, then we can go to what Freud considers as a neurosis, which is, I guess, a person's attempt in order to grasp something, but failing to do so, keeps repeating the same actions over and over again. So the example Freud gave was this lady who could not get over the situation with her husband who passed away. So she kept repeating the same actions in the bedroom. So I guess in a sense, this is her trying to grasp an act of vision, but because she has yet to grasp it, she keeps engaging in these same actions. Then once the neurosis was uprooted, then she no longer engaged in these actions.
Yeah. I mean, what you both are saying is interesting. And if one were to read it against the backdrop of the critique of Freud, carried out by people like Foucault or Derrida or even Heidegger, even though Heidegger doesn't engage much with Freud. Well, this critique says basically that the problem with Freud is that what he calls mental health is supposed to be some kind of fixed status out of which one would deviate or could deviate. And hence mental malady or mental sickness is some kind of deviation from a norm, right? If I remember correctly, that's the critique that mostly Foucault carries out of Freud. At that point, both Plotinus and Freud would be on the same page in presupposing that there is some kind of normative, at that point, normative form, out of which one could, and in fact does most of the times, deviate. So in Plotinus, this deviation manifests itself in praxis, in the attempt of restoring the fullness of the act of vision through a praxis. In Freud, this deviation manifests itself in mental sickness, right? The problem with both thinkers at that point would be, as we said, the hypostatization, the imagining of the existence of some kind of fixed model that, as a model, works also normatively. But as I said, I mean, these are all suppositions based on your suggestions, and I don't have the means to actually explore these things. If you want to explore this, what I suggest you to do is to read, well, Freud on the one hand, Jung on the other, and then to read the critique of Freud by Foucault, and at the same time to see how instead psychology could be practiced, and not so much practice, but first of all, how psychology could be framed in a different way, to read the Zollikon seminars held by Heidegger on exactly the topic of psychology. These are seminars that he held in Zollikon, which is a village in Switzerland, not too far from Freiburg, where he lived. And he held them together with his friend, what was his name? Binswanger, I think, yeah, Binswanger, who was a psychologist, a quite famous one for what I've heard. I mean, Binswanger is on the level, in psychology, it seems, on the level of people like Lacan and Jung and Freud. Again, as I said, I don't know enough about psychology. I myself have not read these seminars in the full form, and the parts I've read, I didn't really reflect on them in relation to psychology per se. So I'm unable to say more than what I already said. But again, your suggestion is quite interesting.
Hi, Prof.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I have a question like about the midterms.
Yeah.
Because after going through the exam, I put a lot of thought in it. I just want to ask, like, why making is the best verb or best actions to conclude?
Why?
Why making?
Can you say it again?
Why is that making is the best action verbs to describe act of vision instead of unfolding, being, and the rest? Yeah.
Because the act of vision is a making. I mean, what happens in the act of vision is the bringing into the fore of something. So how do you call that? Making. Making as producing. And how is this making understood? Once again, as cause and effect. Now, is there another way to think of making? Heidegger thinks there is, and that's what he tries to elucidate when he uses the term Ereignis. But yeah, the act of vision is a making, on the one hand, because it is actually the bringing to the fore of something. On the other, because Plotinus himself says it. The moment Plotinus ranges theoria together with praxis, he's talking about two kinds of making.
See. So, because like Plotinus mentioned a lot of times in the articles of the books, says that the ultimate goal of lack of vision is actually unfolding itself. Isn't it is more closer to being instead? That means that being itself and unfolding instead of making, because making always you're making something out of yourself and be something else.
Yeah, but the point is, what does being mean for Plotinus? Being for Plotinus means exactly this: producing. That's what we've been saying all along. Being for Plotinus means making. Being for Plotinus means the result of a making. Think of the nous. The nous is the result of itself processing itself as or through keeping itself around the one. So it is the result of a process. It is the result of a making, which in the case of the nous is self-making, but it's still a making. So being for Plotinus, this unfolding of being, is possible because of a making. So again, being for Plotinus is a making, which in the case of the nous is making of itself, but it's still a making. Now, making again understood as cause and effect. So ultimately being understood as the result of cause and effect. Again, can we think being in a different way? Or is thinking of being as making exhaustive of being, or does it even tell us anything close to what being actually is? That's the question that we'll have to deal with now that we read Heidegger.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Now Aditya has a question about the principle of identity. The essay speaks about each thing in itself, is itself the same to and with itself, and about how man and being belong to one another. But it is valid to say that man comes from being, since it is being that makes us more human and less animalistic. Okay, any question about the essay of Heidegger? We'll deal with later, not now. So let's leave this aside for now, okay? In any case, the way you pose the question, Aditya, already shows that you've not quite understood what Heidegger says when he says being, because you're thinking of being as a something, and as a something that produces something else, which is not the way Heidegger understands being. Reread again what he says about the relation between being and man, and you'll see that there is anything there but the production of one by the other. Then there is Yongchun again. Perhaps the new admin procedures they keep coming up with for fifth rows as a practice to fulfill the act of vision of traveling as students. Yes, that could very well be. Now, Johannes or Brian, I'm wondering if you could comment on the relationship between philosophy and theology in the quest to understand what it means to be human. How do they interact in your practice as a philosopher, and how do they influence each other? Okay, theology and philosophy. Now, you are familiar with what theology is. Theology is that discipline, that science that studies God, that discipline that tries to come up with a discourse around God. As a phenomenon, theology, the way we commonly understand it, is something that pertains specifically to the three revealed faiths, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. As a discipline, though, it emerged as a separate discipline only in the modern era. In other words, if you asked Aristotle, Aristotle understood philosophy at its highest level as theology, as a discourse around God. Now, what was God for Aristotle? The first cause of everything. It wasn't the God of revelation. So, the problem there is this. If theology is ultimately a branch of philosophy, and hence is a philosophical discipline, and if theology as such concerns itself with God understood as first cause, is this way of approaching the question of the divine good enough to actually talk and frame in any way the religious experience in general, and particularly the religious experience that one has in Christianity or Judaism or Islam? In other words, theology, in the way it came to be through history after the appearing of Christianity and Islam, theology is the attempt to close or to frame certain religious experiences within the tenets of philosophy, within the conceptual instruments of philosophy. Is this attempt to grasp the divine, to grasp the religious, and particularly the experience of Christianity and Islam or Judaism, is this attempt satisfactory? Is this attempt, can this attempt give us anything substantial about these experiences, or does it cover them up? Heidegger thought that it covers them up. If you read, for example, the letter on humanism, Heidegger notices that the way in which theology as a philosophical discipline speaks about the divine hides from us the real origin of this phenomenon. But Heidegger is not the only one to think that. The first one who started a ferocious, almost, critique of any philosophical, hence theological, attempt to talk about the Christian experience is, for example, Pascal. Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician, by the way. Another one is Kierkegaard. And even before these modern figures, you have in antiquity a figure that has posed to himself the question, how can I understand, how can I grasp the Christian experience that I went through? And he tries with the means of, he tries to do that with the means, the conceptual means of Greek philosophy. That person is St. Augustine. Also, St. Augustine notices, even though not in a polemical way like Pascal or Kierkegaard or later on Heidegger, but Augustine does notice that the conceptual means of Greco-Roman philosophy are not enough to grasp the experience he has gone through. Okay, so I don't know if I answer your question. think Brian disappeared. Okay. Any other question?
So, so going on from the same point, does this mean that it is this inability to explain the phenomena in its entirety the result of the practice of philosophy to understand it itself, or because this understanding is the understanding of something that is beyond words, like the divine?
No, it's not beyond words, because the divine always comes to words, right? I mean, in fact, if you think of it, the first words that the human being pronounced are words that have to do with the divine. So the divine is not beyond words, is in words. The problem is what manifests itself when the human being relates to the divine. That's the problem. Is the divine, moreover, as experienced in the revealed faiths, so Christianity, for example, is the divine, can the divine be talked about in terms of first cause, rational cause of all things that are? Can it be talked of in this way? Or there is something else that escapes the kind of language proper to philosophy, not language in general, but a certain kind of language. Because philosophy has a certain kind of language, which it shapes. And it shapes it because of the way, it shapes it in that way because of the way in which philosophy directs thought, because in the way in which philosophy shapes thought. So is the kind of language proper to philosophy and the kind of thinking proper to philosophy sufficient or adequate to talk about this experience, which is the religious experience, which as such and as a human experience is already in language? There is no human experience that is outside of language. Okay? So that's the question. I don't know if this is clear.
It gets a bit confusing because the one is spoken of as something outside of language in the sense that it's not discursive.
Yeah, it's not discursive, it's outside of language, but you see, the moment I say is outside of language, the point of departure is language.
So even those religious experiences which do not involve any kind of discursive thought, they can still be mentioned in language as referring to something outside of it.
Of course, I mean, that's why I say that even when we refer to something that is outside of language, we are still within language. That's why I say that there is no human experience that is outside of language. Any human experience as an experience is within language, at the fringe maybe of language, at that threshold in which language is not language more, but is still within language.
Thank you. Ying-Hao, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just thinking about the first point on language, because there are certain phrasings and things that cannot be translated across languages, right? Like, for example, different forms of emotion are saying, but it's okay, it's okay. It's nothing very. I'll just listen to Rob's elaboration.
So what's your question regarding this?
No question, no question.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Nobody? Okay, then maybe let's do this. I will give you now a very quick introduction for those of you who know nothing about Heidegger, just to know who the guy is, okay, so that this name doesn't float in the void. So Martin Heidegger has been a German philosopher. He lived he was born at the end of the 19th century. He was born in 1879 and died in 1976. Sorry, he was born in 1889, sorry. He was born in 1889 and died in 1976. Through his life, he traversed the entirety of the 20th century and its tragedies, and he was witness to some momentous transformation, namely the slow but steady, well, not even so slow, the steady conquest of what we call now the technological world of all dimension of human life. He himself started as someone who reflected on Aristotle, okay, and his approach to Aristotle and philosophy was determined by what is called the Neo-Kantian school. Neo-Kantian school is a school of thought that wanted to pick up again certain approaches that Kant had started developing and which they thought had been then neglected by subsequent thinkers. In any case, Heidegger didn't remain a neo-Kantian, quite the opposite. He went on to study with Husserl, who's the founder of phenomenology. And starting from his collaboration with Husserl, he was able of framing his ideas and his approach in a new, more fruitful way. The question that leads all of Heidegger's investigation is the question of being. What does it mean, being? What is being? And to this question, he has dedicated all his life. The first attempt to give or to provide a path to approach this question, to prepare the terrain for posing this question properly, he makes this first attempt in his masterpiece, his book, published in 1927, called Being and Time, Sein und Zeit. That book is unfinished. It was supposed to have 2 parts, to have 2 volumes, but he didn't even finish the first volume. And it was left unfinished because as he was proceeding with it, he realized that the very language that he was using, which was the language of Western metaphysics, the language of Western philosophy, was inadequate to really go to the question he wanted to get to. In his subsequent writings, which mostly appeared after his death or appeared during his life as seminars or small essays, he keeps reflecting on the question of being, and he gradually develops a new vocabulary to talk about this question and to formulate a thought around this question. This new vocabulary he elaborates mostly in writings that have been published only after his death, out of his own decision, out of his own will. the most important of these posthumously published writings is the contributions to philosophy. Reflections of that work, the contributions to philosophy, are found in all the seminars, essays, and articles that he published since 1940 until his death. The particular essay that we are dealing with is one such essay, one that was published during his lifetime, and which bears mark of this thought that was unfolding in the contributions to philosophy and in other unpublished writings. As you have seen, it was published together with another short essay called the Ontological Constitution of Metaphysics. And the topic of this essay is to investigate, is to try to, not investigate, but to try to think along the sentence of Parmenides, which establishes the sameness of being and thinking, the identity of being and thinking. Now, if you remember, we found that sentence of Parmenides in Plotinus. And in Plotinus, the sameness of thinking and being is interpreted in the sense of thinking, producing being as a tension towards the one. And this becomes apparent particularly in the nous, if you remember. So Plotinus does give an interpretation of the sentence. Plotinus, in his way, does think along Parmenides. And what Plotinus says is the result of being provoked by Parmenides. Heidegger does the same. Heidegger also thinks along the sentence of Parmenides and tries to follow it in what the sentence might say. The path through which Heidegger's thinking unfolds will lead us in a quite different place than the one reached by Plotinus's thought. And by the way, if you read the essay carefully, you will find that the position of Plotinus is exemplified perfectly by Heidegger when he talks about German idealism, speculative idealism. So that is why I am proposing to you to read this essay, because it gives us, through a reflection on that very sentence of Parmenides that is so central to the Ennead we read, it gives us a very sharp way to come up with a distinction between Heidegger and Plotinus. Now, the goal of coming up with a distinction between these two thinkers is not just to say, oh, Heidegger thought that, Plotinus thought that, but is to look and see whether being and being, as such, can be only understood as the result of a making, and in turn this making can be only read within the frame of cause and effect, or whether there is another way to think of being. Now, why is this important? It is important because Heidegger suggests it is through the understanding of being as the result of making. It is through that understanding that throughout 2000 years of history, the world in which we live, determined by technique, determined by a relation to things based on functionality, calculability, and so on and so forth, has come. So the world in which we live comes ultimately out of the understanding of being established in Greek thought, in the thought that starts with Plato and ends with Plotinus. That is why we are asking the question whether it is possible to think being in a different way, and that is why we are comparing Heidegger with Plotinus, okay? It's in order for us to find, on the one hand, a fuller understanding of the situation in which we live. On the other, to investigate the possibility of getting out of this situation, a possible alternative to this situation, okay? All right, am I clear enough? Okay, good. So I would stop here for today, and we'll see each other on Tuesday. So by, say, Saturday in the afternoon, you're gonna have the entire translation, but you can start reading it, okay? Now, my recommendation to you is to read it very, very slowly, very, very carefully, and following all the passages that Heidegger, all the steps that Heidegger takes. Heidegger is a thinker like Aristotle that proceeds step by step, little step by little step. And he pays attention and forces the reader to pay attention to each step. This is something that is very difficult to do. And philosophers, even philosophers, usually don't do that. Only the absolutely great philosophers do that. Heidegger is one of them. Plato is, of course, the chief of all of them. Aristotle, Hegel, Kant. These are the ones that really go step by step, and St. Thomas Aquinas. I right now cannot think of any other philosopher that proceeds this step-by-step way. So follow him step by step, and do not take for granted any step. Understand how he goes from one step to the other. He makes it clear as much as he can. So you have to make the effort to really follow him. My translation, if you have time to compare it with the other translation, my translation is way more precise. The other translation was even wrong in certain parts. It translates really everything, whereas the other translation skips certain sentences, very conveniently skips the difficult ones. And above all, what I've tried to do in my translation is to keep as much as possible a simple language. Heidegger, if you can read him in German, uses a very simple language. But it is in the simplicity of the language that he forces us to do this very difficult thing of going step by step. So please, as you read him carefully, going step by step. And after all, we're talking about 10 pages. So it's not an impossible task. All right. Okay, guys. So I'll see you on Tuesday.
Oh, were we going to talk about the essay that we're supposed to write for the exam?
Ah, yeah. Let's do that on Tuesday, okay?
Sure.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Prof.
Bye.
Take care.
See you.
See you. Bye.